Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the Hillsborough County Board of County Commissioners Budget Workshop to order. So I'm going to welcome everyone again. We're going to have this workshop today. As you know, we do not take votes during workshops. We can only have discussions and make recommendations to the staff. So we're scheduled to go until 4 p.m. That's 2.5 hours. Hopefully we get everything done by that time. If we can get it done before that time, we'll be appreciative. So I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Merrill. Mr. Merrill, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you see my slides up there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm going to take just a little bit of time to try and put a frame around the discussion today and some context. These are extraordinary, uncertain times, and an additional challenge in terms of putting together a budget. But if it's any consolation, the ground is always shaky, times are always uncertain. It's just, they're even more so now. And it just does add another significant layer of difficulty. But nevertheless, to try and frame this, I mean, so the added piece of the COVID virus is obviously an element of financial budgeting that we've never had to deal with. Even the recession, the Great Recession, was different, even though it was a very difficult time. In a certain sense, it was not as uncertain because it was due to a circumstance that we were not unfamiliar with, business downturns. And there's certain aspects of business downturns that are more predictable, they're more manageable. However, the economic circumstances and financial challenges we have are not, in this case, based on a business cycle downturn or really a weakness in the economy. It's really due to the implications and consequences of the virus. So back on April 19th, the New York Times published a rather lengthy article based on their discussions with 20 experts in public health, medicine, epidemiology. And so, I mean, I guess the good news is this will end. Not sure when, although many of them said that once the crisis is over, the nation's economy would revive quickly. It would require a staged approach, which we've been hearing, to reopening, which we've been hearing lately. So again, uncertainty, but knowing that at some point it will end. But the thing that makes this so difficult, again, going back to the comparison to a typical business downturn, is even though the economy and economics is driven by human behavior, commodities, purchases, consumer behavior, what's different here is a behavior that none of us have really ever dealt with, and that's how we all react to, how we all manage ourselves and others to get to a place where we are through this thing. And that's unpredictable, as we've seen. Fear and other, emotions that play into it directly affect how long it will take, and how long it will take affects the economy, and how long the economy takes to recover affects our budget. So Kevin is going to take you through some economic forecasting, but I think at this point, the bottom line is that some of the best economists and those who do this for a living can't really agree at this point on how deep it's going to be, how long it will last, what the effect will be. This is just sort of a summary of what Kevin will talk about in more detail. So with all of that as a framework, we have Kevin and his folks and Tom and Bonnie have forecasted over the next 2 years and the remainder of this year what kind of budget reductions we may need to weather the storm. So in FY20, the remainder of this year, we're not seeing any budget cuts. FY21, fiscal year 21, the countywide general fund, which is traditionally a strong strong funding source, we're probably okay. So the first budget cuts would start to turn up in fiscal year 22 in the countywide general fund. The unincorporated general fund, which, as you know from prior discussions, has been a concern because of its overall weakness, it will be where the major impacts will be in terms of budget cuts, primarily in FY21 and trailing FY22. When we look at this in terms of what you're used to seeing, Kevin's 5-year projections, he's sort of presented this with a number of different scenarios. Slow recovery commencing in July of this year. You can see how in both general funds the budget deficits play out through FY25. Another scenario, slow recovery commencing in September of this year. And you can see that the deficits in both funds are much higher, or somewhat higher. 2 more scenarios, slow recovery commencing in January and October of next year. And again, of course, deficits increase as we, on the government side, experience lower revenues as well as higher costs due to greater social services, greater needs, and other expenditures related to the virus. So as we're approaching this budget, and we will deliver to you a recommended budget at your second meeting in January, we're coming at it with a priority approach, much as we did back in the Great Recession. In this case, public health, employee health and safety it has to be number 1, because that is what will help lead us to a good conclusion here by all of the good practices that you've heard about over and over again that have to be reinforced, and a lot of that involves some additional cost. Second priority, repayment of debt. We have to maintain our creditworthiness. We have to maintain our critical assets. We have to rebuild our reserves, which we have begun to draw down to some extent while we were waiting for federal grant money. We have, of course, continuing critical deficiencies in areas that are important to take care of in an event like this: fire rescue, water and sewer, transportation, stormwater. We may want to recommend some investment and changes to services programs that have a focus on reducing recurring operating costs, for the obvious reason that you saw the trailing budget deficits in the earlier slide. And then to the extent that this takes longer to recover, we may want to look at divesting ourselves of some non-critical assets to generate cash, especially in the unincorporated fund. There's also obviously an impact of growth. So, obviously no secret, we've talked about our transportation deficits and other infrastructure deficits. We have a number of permitted developments, or developments that are zoned and entitled, which, if they continue to build out, even at a slower pace, just adds additional stress to already stressed out infrastructure. A corollary to that is that the needs and demands of the school system to provide additional classrooms require, at least in the 2 schools that are currently under discussion, require some significant infrastructure needs to support those schools in the way that they are traditionally designed and in areas of the county where they're being planned. But without necessary funding, it will be very difficult for us to meet concurrency to allow those schools to open as designed and where they're planned to be sited. So we'll be talking about impact fees later in the workshop. And so how does all of that relate then to impact fees? So it's a bit of a push-pull. Needing greater resources to fund deficits, transportation deficits, when we know that there will be some new development coming on board, even in a slower economy, means that the tendency would be to say we should, increase fees to generate the revenues we need to help fill the gap. And that is perfectly something you'd expect. It's a legitimate way to look at things. Raising fees will have some effect on housing prices, which will have some impact on the number of units that get built. It will have an impact on already stressed out rents and so forth. So on the other hand, we would, needing to continue to employ people during an economic downturn is important. And so we really have the two opposing goals here. However, regardless of what the board decides to do on impact fees, mobility fees, there still is the ability under state law at various levels of average median income to waive those fees for affordable housing, especially near job centers. When we bring to you at your May 6th meeting some recommendations on how to spend the first tranche of federal grant money that came to us, a portion of that we would like to dedicate to affordable housing. That will provide a very much needed source of gap funding to make affordable housing projects more able to be financed, basically. On the commercial development side, again, going back to the ideal in these kinds of economic downturns is to try and keep people employed, which means keeping businesses doing what they need to do. Ideally, a goal there would be to not, in the short run, increase fees on commercial development to help incentivize job creation and creation of asset value and spur innovation. But there's sort of a legal fly in the ointment, which is an equal protection argument, whereby you cannot apparently not increase certain fees and increase other fees. There may be an approach to that if the board wants to pursue it. We need additional external consulting help, though, to try and figure that out. So this is a summary of the fees you're going to see later in the presentation, just summarized in the table. Currently, the total mobility fees, parks, water, wastewater, AGRF, school impact fees are about almost $13,000 for, as the notes say, this is for a single family home. If the board increased all the fees to the maximum level in the studies that you're being shown today, we'd be looking at anywhere from 25,000, almost 25,500, up to 28,300 for a single family home. I did make this change right here. If you can see my cursor in the parks impact fee, you got a revised study that we sent to you on Friday that there were some adjustments by the consultant that resulted in the parks impact fee going up to 3,300. My original slides that I submitted as part of the agenda today had the earlier number, which was about 3,200. So that's the only change I made there. Enterprise funds. This is a critical area. As you know, we've talked about the need to expand the South County treatment plant and to do the low pressure sewer system, just to avoid disruption to current customers, not even thinking about future growth needs. So we're going to show you something that keeps user fees flat, that does reinstitute the AGRF and increases impact fees, which will help us put in place a temporary solution to the South County treatment plant needs. Solid waste collection, we're not going to deal with that today. As I mentioned, or as I described in a memo, I think, to the board. We are currently negotiating with the current franchise haulers. The objective there is to keep fees at current levels for 3 years and then increase thereafter. We're not going to deal with that today, but I just wanted to put that on the table. That's another area we have to deal with. Stormwater assessments come back to you at your May 6th meeting. If you recall last year, I guess, or yeah, I guess it was last year, the board had adopted a schedule of progressive increases in stormwater assessments to deal with the backlog in that area. And so that's how we would be moving forward with those scheduled graduated increases in stormwater assessments, unless the board directs us to take a different course of action. Grant money, we received the first tranche of our direct payment, $256 million last week. $6.3 million we received in CDBG and emergency solutions grants. Head Start on the nationwide basis has gotten a good chunk of money, which we benefit from. Social services nationally, $1 billion, which we'll see flow down to us for community service block grants. Likewise with the low-income housing energy assistance, LIHEAP, to $900 million nationally, which is flowing down. And then we did receive the amount shown for aging services and criminal justice. There will be more federal grant money on the way in subsequent actions by Congress, and we'll keep you posted on those. On your board meeting on this May 6th next week, we'll be bringing an agenda item with recommendations on how to allocate the first $256 million. These are the criteria that everyone has to abide by who receive these grants. And so we'll be bringing that to you next week. And with that, I believe I am done. And we can move on to
Mr. Fessler.
Mr. Fessler, yes.
Mr. Fessler, you recognize.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is Tom Fessler, Assistant County Administrator of Financial Services. I had a PowerPoint presentation for you today. I just wanted to run through some information on basically, I'll start off with, this presentation is a little bit different than ones we've gone through before. Most of the time when we do a budget presentation, we're focused more on the uses side of things, but today we're going to focus a little bit more on the sources or revenue side of things. The reason we're doing that is it'll identify those areas in the budget where we anticipate to have revenue shortfalls, which will be the areas where we'll have to focus our efforts when we try to balance this year's budget. So on slide number 2, right here, you can see that we've got a total county budget of
Mr. Fessler, we can't see your slides.
Yeah, you need to show your slides, Mr. Fessler.
I guess give me 1 second. I'm sorry, Commissioners.
It's okay.
Tom, this is James Brewer. If you would like for me to share your presentation, looks like you're ready.
Yep, I'm sorry. I didn't do the share function, my fault.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so on the slides today, or the presentation today, again, we'll be focusing more on the revenue side of things. So you can see in the fiscal year 20 budget, we've got a total budget of $6.6 billion. About $2.6 billion of the $6.6 billion is our revenues, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. Fund balance, you can see, is $2.3 billion. Fund balance, as we've said before, is basically your savings account, so to speak. So the fund balance is there to support your reserves that are in the budget, which are about $1.5 or $6 billion. It also supports a lot of your capital projects, your CIP fund. And while the fund balance could be part of the solution to help us balancing the budget, it won't be a large part. The next line there is transfers. As we've talked about before, that's more of an accounting tool that doesn't really actually represent actual cash. It's just a way of us moving money around within the budget. So any dollar that we have on the revenue side will be offset by a dollar on the expenditure side, and they get net to zero. And then finally, we've got the other category there, which represents some debt proceeds for bond issues that we have outstanding, and those proceeds would be committed to certain capital projects. This is where we're going to start to try to drill down a little bit. So this is, again, where we're going to spend most of our time, which is looking at total county revenues. As you can see, the largest portion of those revenues would be taxes. So in just a second, we'll go through what all those taxes are and what the impacts might be from the COVID event. And we've got charges for services, which are primarily made up of our utility system revenues and also some internal charges within the county. We've got intergovernmental, which represents funds that we typically would receive through either grants or from the state of Florida, some licenses and permits, miscellaneous, and then fines and forfeitures. Now we're going to we'll drill down a little bit into the tax revenue. So the largest revenue that we have here is ad valorem. So ad valorem tax revenue makes up about 65% of all of the tax revenue. And then we've got community investment, the community investment tax, and indigent healthcare tax revenues. Those are half-cent sales taxes that are discretionary sales taxes that are implemented by the county. We've got tourist development taxes, fuel taxes, communication services tax, and then other. So the first tax we're going to look at is the ad valorem. And one of the, probably maybe some of the good news in the event that we're going through now, if there is any good news, is that our ad valorem source is probably one of our more stable sources of revenue. And being a larger source of revenue to the county, it's really going to benefit us significantly. We anticipate that will be stable over the next 18 months. We've collected, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 90% of all the ad valorem tax revenue that we anticipate receiving this year. We typically budget ad valorem tax revenue at 95% of what we anticipate receiving, based on a statutory requirement where we have to back out 5%. And we normally collect about 96% of the revenue that's budgeted. So we anticipate that for fiscal year 20, we're going to be right on target with our ad valorem revenue collections. We also anticipate that in fiscal year 21, we're going to have taxable revenues that are going to be very stable. We had been projecting about an 8% increase, and we still anticipate that will be about the level of increase that we can anticipate receiving. That's based on the fact that the taxable values were established back on January 1st of 2020 for the fiscal year 21 budget. I know one of the questions that may come up is we may have some delinquencies as it relates to the fiscal year 21 ad valorem taxes. We don't anticipate that will have a material impact on collection. Back in the Great Recession, we did not see an overly significant impact, and we do not anticipate it this time either, just based on the way that the tax system is set up. We've got the tax certificates that are sold, and so we eventually will receive our money as it relates to ad valorem. Most of our risk is going to be associated with the out year, fiscal year 22. So that's where we may start to see some impacts because those taxable values will be set on January 1st of 2021. And based on the recovery, we could see some impacts there. The funds that receive ad valorem revenues are your countywide fund, countywide general fund, your unincorporated area general fund, and the library services fund. What do ad valorem revenues fund in those particular funds? Well, you can see in the countywide fund, it's for countywide services, human services type activities, the environmental lands program, emergency management, pet resources, economic development, medical examiner. A big portion is also that is included in that fund relates to the sheriff's office and funding of the jails. Unincorporated area. As we go through this presentation, you're going to see this is going to be one of our biggest challenges this year when we try to balance the budget. It's been a challenge already. And for reasons that we're going to go through in a few minutes, you'll see why it's going to be even more of a challenge this year. But in the unincorporated area, we fund basically the sheriff's patrol in the unincorporated area. We have our fire rescue department, parks and rec, and you can see some of the other smaller services that are funded there. Then we can get into our community investment tax. So the community investment tax is a half-cent discretionary surtax that's been used to fund community capital improvements. The tax expires in fiscal year 26, and the revenue reductions that we anticipate seeing in fiscal year 20 and 21 could be fairly significant, more significant in fiscal year 21 than in fiscal year 20. We've gotten through the first half of the year with pretty normal collections in that area. So it'll be the next 6 months in fiscal year 20 that we'll see the greatest impacts. Whereas in fiscal year 21, it's all about the timing of the recovery. At this point, we really haven't even seen our first insights into the total impact of what we're going to see in the impacts on the sales tax. We're not really going to know that until near the end of May, because that's when the state of Florida will start to get in sales tax collections for April. And that's when we really started to see the big impacts of what we're going through now. A couple additional points on the community investment tax. The county budgets somewhere in the neighborhood of about $70 million or $144 million a year, but about $70 million of that stays with the county. The remainder goes out to the school district and to the cities and to the Campus Sports Authority. But of the $70 million that we retain, a lot of that goes towards paying debt service on capital projects that we have already completed or are in the process of completing. So one of the points that's important to make here is, can we cover our debt service with the revenues that we anticipate receiving from the CIT? And we believe that we can. The debt service on an annual basis is about $44 million, and our collections definitely should be above the $44 million level. However, an important point to make here is that the tax expires in fiscal year 26, and we had anticipated that between now and the end of fiscal year, or when the tax expires, we would have had about another $175 million in additional pay-go money that would show up. And when we adopted our transportation plan, our $812 million transportation plan, about $150 million of that 175 was counted as dollars that would go towards the 812 plan. Those pay-go dollars, I would say, are probably likely to experience a significant reduction at this point. So it is going to put a lot of pressure on the 812 plan. The indigent healthcare tax, it's another half-cent discretionary sales surtax. We think we're going to be okay here. We are going to see some significant revenue reductions. However, we also have significant reserves that we have in this fund. One of the points on the next slide I want to make is that the board did recently approve some revised eligibility criteria and some new services to be funded. And that was with the idea that we would begin to bring down the reserve levels and eventually match the recurring revenues with recurring expenditures. While we're going to see some pressure on this fund in the short term, we think we're going to be able to make it through and still be able to have a solid base for continuing to provide the services that we committed to. And then here's some just bar charts that kind of show some potential impacts that we think we might see. The first bar there going across, the blue bar, represents collections and actual collections in fiscal year 19. And we're going from some basically best case scenarios to worst case scenarios. When we get to fiscal year 20, I think our best case scenario for this year is maybe losing about $18 million of the revenues that we had budgeted for both the CIT and indigent healthcare tax. And then you can see that when we get out to fiscal year 21, again, as I had described, there's a lot more pressure probably on fiscal year 21 than on fiscal year 20 as it relates to those revenues. So it will be a challenge trying to balance the fiscal year 21 budget. Tourist development tax revenue. Well, this revenue in total is not overly significant in relation to the total budget. This is the tax or the revenue source that will see probably the greatest impact and the greatest reductions from the event that's going on now. The tourist development tax is a tax on hotel and motel accommodations within the county. It's a tax of 6 cents on every dollar, and it's used to promote tourism in Hillsborough County. First 3 cents of the tax, we primarily use for the tourism promotion through an agreement with Visit Tampa Bay. This portion is also, as you can see, funds the Tampa Bay Sports Commission, some visitor information services, some festivals, out-of-area marketing, and is supposed to fund a $2 million investment in the Super Bowl this year. The 4th cent out of the 6 cents is invested in the maintenance of Steinbrenner Field and Raymond James Stadium. And the 5th cent is being used for upgrades and improvements to Amalie Arena. Recently, the board also adopted the 6 cent, and the 6 cent in fiscal year 20, again, is promoting some tourism promotion through Visit Tampa Bay and some improvements to the Tampa Convention Center and upgrades to other various tourist attractions. This slide is different than it was in the materials that went out to you, and I want to make sure that I point that out. So in the materials that went out, there were some statements in there that there would be regular payments made to Visit Tampa Bay and the Sports Commission through April, and that after April, those payments would cease. When we had put this presentation together originally, we were kind of looking at basically a worst case scenario. We've taken a step back. We've had some discussions with Visit Tampa Bay. We met with them yesterday. We also have spoken with the Sports Commission. So revenues will continue to come in after April, and they will continue to be distributed to the extent that we are able to receive those revenues. So the point I want to make here is that Visit Tampa Bay has been very proactive in reducing their personnel costs. They've gone from over 60 positions down to about 21 positions for the short term. They've made some other very material cost reductions in an effort to try to match the remaining revenues that may come in this year with their expenditures that they are probably going to see. I guess one of the key points here is that we just want to make sure that we work with them to try to maintain their core operations so that when we do get to a point when we start to see an economic recovery that they can quickly get back into business and do what they need to do to really assist with that recovery. Kind of the same thing with the Sports Commission. They've implemented some cost reduction strategies, and they are focusing on, they're putting a lot of effort into preparations for the Super Bowl, and they are also now looking at how to kind of rethink some of the both short-term and long-term events that are out there and that are scheduled and the way that we conduct those events. Some other items related to the tourist development tax. We've got some organizations that were awarded some capital improvement funding. Those are some local tourist attractions. We've spoken to them about kind of suspending any capital projects that we had budgeted for that they haven't started yet. And then the final point, or a couple final points I want to make here, is that on the 4th cent and the 5th cent taxes, the point I want to make here is that we do have some debt service or bonds that have been issued that are being funded by the 4th and 5th cent of the tourist development taxes. And we do believe that we will have enough revenues to be able to cover the debt service obligations, which is our primary concern. In the short term, we may have some difficulty funding some other of commitments that we've made to some of the local sporting revenue or venues for some of the improvements that are to be made at those facilities. And then also, I do need to point out that the $2 million commitment that we had made to the Super Bowl has not yet been funded at this point. And then again, just some bar charts to show some potential impacts on the tourist development taxes. Again, this revenue source is going to be the most volatile. The range of recovery, it could be pretty wide, but we really think it's going to be a while before we really start to see tourists return to the area. We've got fuel tax revenues. Fuel tax revenues fund both operating and capital portions of the county's transportation program. Again, they also fund a portion of the $812 million transportation plan. And so we've anticipate seeing a very significant drop in these revenues. As you can imagine, there aren't very many cars on the road right now in the short term. As the economy opens back up, we may see a relatively quick snapback of this, but we don't anticipate seeing it snap back to the levels that we were at before the COVID event. We anticipate that we're still going to have some tourism declines. We're going to have some businesses that continue to telework employees, and then we're going to have some businesses that probably permanently close. And then here's just some ranges of some potential impacts for the fuel tax. Not as volatile as the tourist development tax, but we still could see some fairly significant impacts over the short term. Other tax revenues, that would be we've got the communication services tax. If there's one tax that may actually benefit from the event, this may be it. We've got a lot of teleworking going on, a lot of communications over the phone. So this is a tax we don't really anticipate seeing much impact to. And a good portion of this tax does go to support the fire rescue budget. Then we've got the transportation sales surtax also, the new discretionary surtax. So while there could be some significant impacts to the revenue there, we haven't actually appropriated any projects in our capital program yet against that revenue because of the case that's pending up in the Florida Supreme Court as it relates to these revenues. So while it could be a significant impact of the revenue stream, it really will not impact any currently budgeted CIP projects. And then you can see on the communication services tax, we really don't anticipate to see much of any impacts on that revenue stream. Then we get to charges for services, $663 million. Majority of that relates to our water enterprise fund and our solid waste system. Don't anticipate seeing too many impacts to those revenues. There could be some, but we don't anticipate those to be overly significant. Internal charges are things like indirect charges, and I won't get too much into that, between some of our funds. It's basically charges between various funding sources within the county. That would be also we have our fleet department. So the fleet department charges out to our various departments, charges for services. And then also that's a significant portion of the internal charges is related to our insurance program. So it's really just moving money around within the county. So those don't represent any external revenues to the county. And then as you can see, we've got some smaller sources there, which include, ambulance fees, development services, court fees, sheriff's fees, et cetera. Intergovernmental revenues, $355 million. So we've got basically grants, our half-cent sales tax, some other state shared revenues, some more fuel taxes. When we start taking a look at the grants piece of it, this is probably an area where we don't expect to see too many negative impacts. So if anything, and you're going to see in a slide coming up, we could actually see some increases in the level of grant revenue that we receive to help out with what's going on right now. So I know our Head Start program is anticipating seeing some additional dollars come in. Same thing with aging services and social services and the healthcare services department. So we anticipate being able to draw down all the current revenues that were budgeted, or the majority of them that were budgeted in the fiscal year 20 budget. So we don't really see much of an impact in the grant revenues. Actually, we might actually see a positive increase in the grant revenues. Of course, that's going to be offset by expenditures that we're incurring to earn those revenues. And we've got our half-cent sales tax program. The important thing to understand, again, we're going to see some significant impacts here. And the important thing to understand is that the majority of those revenues right now are going to the unincorporated area general fund. So the countywide general fund is not going to see a tremendous amount of stress from this event because they're reliant primarily on ad valorem taxes, which we said earlier, and they don't rely heavily on sales surtax or the sales tax. So the countywide general fund, we will have a pretty probably, it won't be that difficult to balance. However, when we get to the unincorporated fund, we've got about $86 million of sales tax that goes to the unincorporated area fund. So there's a lot more heavy reliance on that tax versus ad valorem taxes. So we're going to have a real challenge this year with the unincorporated fund. We will figure it out, but we will have a big challenge. To do that, let's see. And again, just give you some best and worst case scenarios here. Anticipate seeing some, pretty significant short-term impacts, but then we should start to see a recovery. License and permit revenues, we've got impact and mobility fees at $55 million. We've got our stormwater assessments, our assessment units associated with the water department, and some development fees and street lighting assessments. And fines and forfeitures, most of the revenues in this area are from interest revenue. Probably sees some minor impacts here, not something that's going to have a big impact on us though. And then other than the interest revenue, there are just a lot of very, small amounts that go across the board. So just kind of a summary of everything. The areas that we're going to see the greatest impacts would be the unincorporated area general fund, first development taxes, and then our ability to continue to fund the $812 million transportation plan. Because as you are aware also, when we balanced the fiscal year 20 budget, we actually suspended the policy associated with this year because we needed to reduce the amount of funding that was coming from ad valorem to fund transportation plan. And now we're seeing some additional stresses on the plan from some other revenue sources. So that's going to be a real challenge for us. Then Mr. Merrill has gone over some of the potential new funding streams that we might see. So most of this was presented on his slides. So again, this goes back to receiving some additional grants in our human services area. Some of the other risk factors that we think we might see, definitely we're going to see increased demand for human services. We could potentially see some significant increases in our Florida retirement system rates. As there are impacts on the retirement system, they will pass those increases back down to us. There might be some possibility of some unreimbursed COVID-19 costs, new safety protocols. Our nonprofit partners are already calling for assistance in a lot of cases. We might have some costs associated with restructuring how we deliver county services. We could have a new model we need to put in place for a hurricane season for how we shelter people. And then we also know that the courts are experiencing some significant stresses. The courts system, I guess, is shut down, so they're seeing a lot of revenue losses. And we do know that in some cases, county clerks are going to their boards requesting support to make up for lost revenue. And then just wanted to give you a kind of a snapshot of our county debt. Again, we think we're in good shape here. If there's, we're in a solid position, we believe, as it relates to our debt. We've got $1.2 billion in outstanding debt, but we believe that the revenue sources that support those debt issues are, for the most part, in pretty solid shape. With that, that would be the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Fessler, for that presentation. We're now going to move on to Mr. Bricky for 5-year Proforma analysis. Mr. Bricky.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. We need to do roll call. It was omitted.
I'm sorry, it wasn't on the agenda. I'm sorry. Please call the roll.
Miller.
Here.
Hagan. Hagan. Kemp.
Here.
Merman. Merman. Overman.
Here.
Smith.
Here.
White.
Here.
Merrill. Merrill,
I'm here.
Merman's here too. Sorry, I was on mute.
Commissioner Hagan, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. It's Ken.
Okay. Okay, Mr.
you have
Bricky.
a quorum, sir.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Bricky, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kevin Bricky with Management and Budget. I'm going to take you through a presentation looking at the 5-year pro forma and where we think we stand. And is it on?
Yes.
I think it's on. Thank you very much. So the pro forma follows on with the things that Mr. Fessler spoke about, looking at our different revenues, primarily for ad valorem and sales tax revenues that would go into the 2 general funds. Taxable property values, we expect about 8% growth for FY21. As Mr. Fessler mentioned, we don't expect an impact at FY21 from the COVID event because taxable values were set for FY21 on January 1st of this year. As we've done in the past, we've looked at 20-year average annual growth over the last 20 years. It's been about 5.7%. We continue to model that in our main scenarios that I'll be showing you. On the expenditure side, we have some of our usual assumptions. We model most non-personnel costs to rise at the combined rates of population and government inflation, about 5.2%. We have some personnel wages in there, contractual wages from collective bargaining units we have in there. The countywide general fund is modeled with additional funding for affordable housing over the $10 million approved in FY20, additional funding for children's services initiatives, technology improvements, call center upgrades. The pro forma is modeled with increases in sheriff's deputies for FY 22 to 25. The original plan was to include that for FY21. The sheriff is taking a break on that for FY21 in these circumstances. The pro forma is also modeled with the transportation plan, the 812 transportation plan, which was suspended for FY20. It is modeled to be flat or essentially suspended for FY21 to FY25 as well. There are 2 new fire stations funded in FY20. The pro forma does not assume any others going forward. Now here is the baseline pro forma before the COVID-19 event, where we thought things were. And this shows this very similar to previous appearances where we've discussed the 5-year forecast, that the countywide fund is in pretty good shape and has some surpluses in the outer year, and that the unincorporated general fund is under stress. In this case, before the event, we were looking at a deficit in FY25 of about $98.5 million. The fund is under stress due to public safety expenditures and needs. In this case, again, this is without resuming the 812 plan. So we're still experiencing those stresses in the fund. Now we're going to take a look at different scenarios for the pro forma with the COVID-19 impact. As Mr. Fessler mentioned, our April revenue impacts will be available in late May or early June. Our property values for FY21 are already set. So the big question is, when will economic activity begin to recover? And we're going to take a look at 4 basic scenarios where economic activity begins to recover in July of 2020, another one where it begins to recover in September of 2022, a fourth one in January of 21, and a fourth one in October of 21. And the premise behind those is that when does the economy reopen? How quickly might the economy reopen? How quickly does the pandemic subside or not subside, and when? And so the longer it takes for the economy to reopen, or the longer it takes for the pandemic to subside, then we get into those outer scenarios of sustained recovery happening more in sometime in FY21. And that is reflects the national forecasters. I know Mr. Merrill mentioned that there's quite a lot of uncertainty, even among economic forecasters, as to how this will affect the economy. The National Association for Business Economics is a trade organization that takes the forecasts of a number of forecasters and looks at the median forecast from many well-known individual and institutional forecasters. Its April forecast, the median forecast, is that the U.S. economy is going to contract during the first half of 2020, that real gross domestic product already declined about 2.4% at an annual rate in the first quarter, and that the second quarter will decline 26.5%, a very steep, deep dive in the second quarter. But the forecast panel then projects growth in the second half of 2020, supported by aggressive fiscal and monetary stimulus. The consensus forecast is 2% growth in the third quarter, followed by 5.8% growth in the fourth quarter, and 6% growth in the first quarter of 2021. But again, it depends on when sustained growth truly happens. Moody's Analytics, they're one of the forecasters that is included in the National Association of Business Economics consensus forecast. Moody's is forecasting a deeper contraction than the consensus from NABE, followed by stronger third quarter growth. Moody's is forecasting a second quarter decline of 30%, so about 5 percentage points deeper, and a growth in the third quarter of 16.7%. So a deeper decline followed by a somewhat stronger bounce in the third quarter. On a yearly basis, Moody's is looking at a 5.8% decline in 2020, followed by 2.3% growth in 2021. Not enough to recover losses. Most forecasters are looking at recovery of the full losses, maybe in 2022, maybe in 2023. But Moody's is looking or expecting that the recovery will be W-shaped as opposed to V-shaped, where it's a quick bounce back. Moody's, as well as it seems to be the consensus of economic forecasters, is expecting a bounce upwards in the summer as the economy is slowly reopened. But after that, through the rest of the year and into 2021, that the economy very likely may just tread water and not grow very strongly due to lingering economic effects of the shutdown. And as Mr. Fessler mentioned, that some businesses won't be coming back, some individuals will take longer to find new jobs or for their jobs to come back. And so there might be lingering demand effects that cause growth to be relatively flat after an initial bounce after reopening. Other forecasters are looking at very similar things. Deloitte and Goldman Sachs are looking at an 8.3% drop. Deloitte is looking at an 8.3% drop in GDP in 2020, followed by 2.9% growth in 2021. Goldman Sachs foresees a deep contraction, 3.8% decrease for 2020. The International Monetary Fund is very similar, 6% decline in gross domestic product for 2020, followed by a 4.5% increase in 2021. Shimura Economics also is looking at a sharp and short impact. So right now, the consensus is for a very, very deep recession, followed by improvement later this year, but it's going to take a while to regain all lost ground, and it depends on how quickly things can reopen, whether or not there are flare-ups in the future of the virus and those sorts of things. So that can cause things to be further out. So here is the first scenario, a slow recovery that would commence in July of 2020. This is using the same revenue estimates that Mr. Fessler had. That Mr. Fessler had shown. Here we're looking at the general fund, the countywide general fund, still being able to weather this fairly well, and that the stress again is in the unincorporated area fund, whereas the unincorporated fund in FY21 under the previous baseline showed about an $8 million surplus in FY21. This is about a $30 million deficit in FY21. And the outer year deficits increase substantially to about $226 million. This is looking at if things don't really start to improve until the fall, September 2020 or October 2020. This causes the unincorporated fund again to be further in deficit by about $39 million in FY21. Here, the countywide fund still is in pretty good shape over the forecast period. Things get a little worse if the event and recovery doesn't start to improve until January. In this case, we have these revenue losses, particularly in sales tax and half-cent sales tax that affect the unincorporated area, moving further and deeper into FY21, and so the deficit in FY21 in the unincorporated area rises to $44 million. Now, this one is a sensitivity analysis. It's not one of our main scenarios, but here, this is looking at the case where the recovery doesn't begin until January 2021, and we have a negative impact on property value growth in FY22. And this one is looking at a case where instead of having about 5.7% growth, sorry about that, 5.7% growth in property values for FY22, that growth is reduced to about 2.8%. And then that indeed then does start to affect the countywide general fund, and we see deficits later in the year, in the forecast period. This is our fourth main scenario where the recovery doesn't really commence until October 2021. So our deficit in the unincorporated fund rises to close to $47 million, and the outer years build to about $313 million. On the countywide general fund, we see some difficulties in the ensuing years of about $19 million, $20 million deficits. Those are probably manageable given the uncertainty of looking at the outer years. So again, the countywide fund is in fairly good shape. And then we have, again, a sensitivity analysis. Here we're looking at the economy not really starting to improve until October 2021. And this sensitivity analysis is looking at FY22 property values, what would happen if it was 0% growth. And of course, we see large difficulties in the countywide fund developing and in the unincorporated fund. But again, this is a sensitivity analysis. We're not expecting to see large impacts in property value growth at this time, but just wanted to show you what could happen if we had those types of impacts. And Mr. Chairman, with that, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Bricky. Appreciate it very, very much. We're now going to move into county revenue and fee discussions. Start off with park impact fees with Mr. Rick Valdez. Mr. Valdez, you recognize. Mr. Valdez.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Miller and fellow esteemed commissioners. Sorry, I was having a few little phone. This is Rick Valdez, Director of the Parks and Recreation Department. I am joined by Forrest Tuberville, Director of the Conservation and Environmental Lands Management Department, Cameron Clark from our County Attorney's Office, and Ben Griffin and Carson Bice of the Tischer Bice Consulting Firm. We want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to bring the draft park impact fee study forward today. And I want to thank all the gentlemen who have been working with me on this study to bring it forward in an accelerated format. I will continue providing the most up-to-date draft as small changes are made, just as I did this Saturday. So I hope all of y'all received the changes with the memo, and I did my best to go through and highlight on each page where changes were made. Ben Griffith from Tischer Bice will be presenting a brief update, and our team will remain to answer any questions. Ben?
Thanks, Rick. All right, let's see. All right, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
All right. So we just want to do a very quick overview of the status of the park impact fees. This one started a little behind some of the other impact fee updates. So we just wanted to run through some of the findings. So we did want to bring up that the last time you updated your park impact fees was 1985. So your current fees are very old, and they're really only looking at a residential component, and they're assessed by the unit type and the number of bedrooms. You also have it broken into 4 areas, and it really only focused on traditional parks. So the draft report is attached to the agenda. So you can see that the proposed fees, we're looking at assessing them by unit size. So a square footage threshold. We are looking at including hotels and lodging, like some of the other counties in Florida, because those visitors do provide some sort of demand on your park infrastructure. So right now, in the draft fee report, everything is consumption-based or incremental expansion. So essentially what we're doing is saying, this is what you have today or your existing level of service. And this is what it would cost to acquire land or construct facilities or make park improvements, and building the fee based on that. And we're separating it out for 2 components. So Rick, who was just speaking, with Parks and Rec, we consider all that the active recreation. So we're looking at community parks, sports complexes, special use facilities, parks, facilities, and trails. And then with Forrest Tuberville, who is with Conservation and Environmental Lands Management, that is the regional component. And so that includes regional parks, trails, boat ramps, facilities, but it excludes the Environmental Land Acquisition and Protection Program lands. And as seen in the report, we're doing a 10-year projection of revenue. And so we're saying, about 146 million for the active recreation fees and, about 25 million for the regional park fees. And then as one of the commissioners mentioned earlier, we did provide some, projected fees. And so the single family fee would be, about $3,300 as it stands today. Your current fee is $388 per single family unit. But if you adjust that for inflation, so from 1985 to today, it would be about $1,000. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. If you had just kept up with inflation, your fee would have been about $1,000 today. So any questions for me?
No, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. Valdez? Mr.
Yes,
Valdez,
sir.
you have anything further?
No, sir, that concludes our presentation unless there are questions.
No. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Now moving to mobility fees, Ms. Garces.
Commissioners, thank you. This presentation today is really an update. It's the revised mobility fee study that was delivered just a week ago, April 21st of 2020. So it doesn't include making of the watch. It really does just include those key issues that have been of interest in the discussion on the last mobility fee study. The study was initiated back at the end of 2018 based on some changes that came out of the ITE trip generation table. And I think best to go through this would be Nilgun Kemp of Tyndale Oliver. So Nilgun, you can take it away. And Mr. Brewer, we can move to the next slide.
Good afternoon, Nilgun Kemp with Tyndale Oliver. As you know, the impact fees are meant to measure the gap between the cost of new growth and their contribution to our new capital facilities. They need to pass the test of being reasonable and proportional, and they are based on averages. So they need to have a technical study that complies with with all the legal requirements. And the methodology used to develop this impact fee study has been established over the past 30 years and has been not challenged for any issues with the legal compliance. So it's been pretty well established and used Florida-wide. So we had some different items that we wanted to go over. In terms of the construction cost, when we started the study, we were looking at a longer time frame, and we were seeing some increases on the recent years, but the sample size weren't that big. And we developed an average based on a longer time frame to be having a reasonable sample. And we felt that that report complies with all the requirements and establishes a reasonable impact fee. So the methodology for that report and these revisions are the same. So we are using the same methodology. Only thing is that in response to increasing costs since then, and also the concerns from the board, we looked at a shorter time frame and tried to see that to make sure that we are sure to represent current costs. So we work with the county staff. The staff provided a subset of projects that they feel that represents the current cost more accurately. And we looked at, supplemented that information with data from other jurisdictions, reviewed urban county cost increases, rural county cost increases, not just the construction cost, but as well as any relations to right-of-way cost and other elements. So we took quite a bit of time to try to make sure that we are addressing the board's concern and that reflecting a shorter time frame that may be more representative of the current costs. So that's how the construction costs got revised and ended up with a higher cost average. Now, in terms of the surtax, again, because we are not sure what will happen with the surtax, the report includes two sets of calculations, one with, one without. So you see that difference. Trip generation, the IT 10th edition had a lot of changes. Again, they eliminated older data that's more representative of current rates, and we are seeing some decreases in some land uses, some increases. So those got incorporated to the study, just both the first version and the revised version. In terms of the RPT, whether to treat it as rural or urban from a technical study perspective, what we looked at is that the volume of travel in RP2, whether that affects our calculations of fee differential between urban and rural. And RP2 volume makes less than 3% of the travel, so it does not affect the technical calculation, so it is a more of a policy decision. Trip length was, there were concerns about the trip length. Again, one thing to keep in mind on that, this trip length is not only the work to home, but also all trips, like the service trips, retail trips, other service providers trips, and so on. So what we have is an average based on Florida studies. And of course, so we did not revise that. We don't have a better data to base that. But if the county ever wanted to do studies to see what it would come up with today's subdivisions, that's always an option. In terms of just one footnote, that affordable housing, now the law allows the local governments to reduce the fees for affordable housing without having to backfill. So we always had that concern about equity. If we reduce one land use, we are creating a special category, and we can't do that. But that recent change in law allows affordable housing to be treated differently. So if there are any concerns about that you have a lot of flexibility in terms of policy, how much to reduce the fee. So before I move on, again, these fees represent the highest technically calculated fees. Of course, board has the policy option to reduce the fees across the board. Our first version was a reasonable set of calculations, represent as a reasonable set of fees. These are attempting to represent the local or the current data a little bit more tighter in terms of the shorter time frame for construction costs. But again, board has the policy option to adopt either one of the studies or something in between through policy. Next slide. So this slide is showing the changes in the single home fees. So you have for the urban district, for example, the current adopted fee is at $5,000, almost $5,100, and the 2016 calculated fee was about $6,400. So with the surtax credit, that would go to $7,400, and if the surtax was to eliminated, the fee would be $9,200. In the rural, the calculated fee, full calculated fee was $92. That would go to $11,200 or to $13,000 without the surtax. Next slide, please. This chart shows the light industrial. This is one of the land uses that experienced about 30% decrease in trip generation rate. So the full calculated rate per 1,000 square feet in the urban area was about 4,000, and that with the surtax goes down to 3,400, and then without the surtax, it goes up to 4,200. And then in the rural area, it's about 5,900 is the 2016 calculated fee. That would range from 5,200 to almost 6,000, depending on the credit. And there's an example there to showing what a 120,000 square foot building would pay under different fee options. Slide, please. This is the same type of analysis for office, and office is another land use that had a decrease in terms of the generation rate. The calculated fee in 2016 was almost 9,000 per 1,000 square feet, and that would range from 6,700 to 8,300. In the rural area, that was 13,000. It would be 10,000 to almost 12,000. And again, you see an example of a 200,000 square foot office, what they would pay, with the 2016 rates as well as the current calculated rates. Slide. This is doing the same type of analysis for the shopping center, retail, and the full fee was about 10,000. It goes up to 10,100. It goes up to 10,700 under the surtax in the urban area, or to 13,500 without the surtax. And then the rural fees are increasing from 12,000 to 13,000 or almost 16,000 if there is no surtax. Next slide. And this is a bank. Bank is another one that with the internet banking, the trip generation decreased significantly. So the 2016 calculated rate was 21,300 per 1,000 square feet. And that goes up to 16,000 to 20,000, depending on the surtax. And in the rural area, that'd be from almost 26,000 down to almost 20,000 to 24,000. And the next, okay, from here on, we just have the schedules. So I think unless you'd like to go through them, I'll stop here. I think you have it in your packages more as a reference.
Is that the end of the presentation, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Garces?
Commissioner, I just wanted to say that concludes our presentation of the updated fee.
Okay. Thank you very much. Water, wastewater fees, move to that. Mr. Cassidy?
Good afternoon, Board and Mr. Chair. Thank you. I've got a presentation I'll go ahead and pull up.
Mr. Cassidy, that's your backyard?
It's the backyard of my office downtown.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
Looks like he lives on an island.
Is that up? Can everybody see that?
Can everyone see that? Okay, go ahead.
We're good. Well, good afternoon, Commissioners. George Cassidy, Public Utilities Administrator. We wanted to just do a quick run through of our current business situation and where our needs are in the utility, as well as what our impact fees are and what we'd like to propose. Starting from the top, as we've been before you over the last several months, we've talked about our water and wastewater capacity needs. Certainly on the water side and wastewater side in South County, is driven by higher water demands through current development and proposed development. In particular for our water demands, we're seeing during high periods of use, which is typically in the morning, everybody's getting up, starting their day, so everybody's up at about the same time or within a certain bandwidth. We're seeing significant demands cause low pressure problems, and certainly we want to be reliable. We want to maintain a level of service that avoids low pressure concerns in our service area. We need new delivery capacity no later than January of 2023. And in order to do that, quite frankly, we need to be beginning as soon as possible. And I've indicated here that June of this year, we really need to begin the process of having that new capacity online. Similarly, in wastewater, we've got higher levels of wastewater demand in South County. Certainly, if you're using more water, you're generating more wastewater. On the wastewater side, we need new capacity by 2023, and again, starting by this June. When we were before you a number of months ago, we were talking about funding the solution to our water and wastewater capacity needs. And that was a project at the Southeast Landfill. It was approximately $475 million program. When that was initially presented to you, it did have ratepayer impacts as we were looking at really rate adjustments to accomplish borrowing that would allow us to go do this. Going forward, we would like to see or recommend that we look at our impact fees and certainly the AGRF. Because of the extraordinary economic environment that we're in right now, Commissioners, we understand that there's a sensitivity to any fees going up. And we've really been looking at ways to solve our water demand and our wastewater capacity problem without burdening our current ratepayers. And so we do have an alternative phased delivery. It's estimated about $200 million. As Mike had suggested earlier, it's somewhat of a temporary program, although it's not a throwaway. The money that we're spending will apply for the most part to the longer term solution. I will say, though, that it does require that we take a hard look at adjusting impact fees and certainly reinstating AGRF. Looking at our impact fees current and proposed as well as AGRF, I've got a chart here that shows where we are currently. Both water and wastewater combined impact fees are $35.50. We're proposing in the Northwest that go up to $48.14. AGRF is at 0 right now. It's been 0 since April of 2014. And we're suggesting that that come back at 1822. For the South, there's a higher, a pro rata share, higher water and wastewater impact fee. That's because that's where the significant development is occurring. That's where our greatest capacity needs. Therefore, that's our greatest capital investment. So you're seeing a proportionately higher impact fee resulting, and we're looking there at going from $35.50, which is the current, to $58.65. Going back to August of 2019, the board approved 2 years out of our recommended 6-year program. And you see the 2 years that we've got approved already, 20 and 21. It's important to note that in order for this plan to move forward, we do need years 22 through 25 approved. And again, this gets us our original complete large program, our big plant, our $475 million program. It does include all of those elements in this plan. It does include all the elements of the programs we talked about, our septic to sewer, LPSS, the necessary maintenance to make sure our systems are reliable and available to us at all times. So this is the full package. Looking at the alternative plan, the temporary phased plan, you'll see that we're keeping our rates level in 21 and 22, and then they start to ramp up 22 through 25. So this is a $200 million expenditure. What it does for us is provides an additional water main from our main water plant at Lithia in Brandon, taking it south to the south part of the county where we need it the most. It's a pretty expensive pipe, but it does, it's useful in the bigger program. We would have built it anyway. So we're building that to deliver more water. That helps considerably. We're going to add incremental wastewater capacity at our South County plant. And we don't want to be at the South County plant in the long term. I don't believe that's a sustainable location for us. But what we're going to do with this additional wastewater capacity at South County is make it modular and make it relocatable so that when we're ready to move to the larger plant at the Southeast landfill, we'll dismantle this equipment and take it with us. It's not a total loss. This alternative plan does require a serious look at impact fee increases and also reinstatement of AGRF, or quite frankly, we just don't have the cash to fund it without some pretty significant negative impacts to our operation. We are going to continue the the LPSS conversion. It does, it does carry with it a reduced R&R program. We're going to hit pause on septic to sewer for a couple of years while we get this other program started. It's really tightening our belt. It's not doing anything that we just absolutely don't have to, because the most important thing to us right now is getting water to our South County residents and also providing that additional wastewater capacity. And I will highlight that this particular phased adjustment will require us to look at our rates again in 2022. And just for purposes of saying, there's going to be an impact, we put in a swag, an educated guess on what those rate increases would likely be in 23 to 25. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I do have our rate consultant, Rob Worry with Raptellus, on available in case there are any questions for the rate consultant. With that,
Okay.
I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before moving to board discussion, Mr. Merrill, is there anything else you'd like to bring forth?
No, sir. I think that covers our presentation.
Okay, we're now moving to board discussion. Commissioner White, you recognize.
Thank you, Chairman Miller. I'd like to ask Mr. Merrill, I know that we've already adjusted the fire rescue impact fees. How fresh, if you will, is that study? When was it conducted?
It's been in the last couple of years. I don't know this actual date, but I can text somebody while we're meeting here and get the exact date.
Okay.
Mr. Merrill, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, this is Cameron Clark. Can you hear me? Yeah, that was adopted last summer. Fire rescue impact fee study was adopted last summer. Took effect October of last year. I think the study's usually a little older than the adoption date, so it might be 2018 or something like that.
Okay. I know we have tremendous needs in fire rescue, and that's obviously a public safety priority. It's always has been and certainly should remain a top priority of this board. Would it be appropriate to commission a fresh new study for fire rescue?
No, I don't think it's going to show any material differences, and even if it did, it's not going to help our current deficiencies. So, I mean, it helped when we did raise the impact fees, but because most of our funding needs are deficiencies, they cannot be funded with the impact fees anyway. So, my answer probably would be no, not at this point. It's too soon.
Okay. So with respect to the parks impact fees, the mobility fees, is your plan to bring something to the board that's a phased in approach? Or what do you anticipate?
I mean, that's a possibility. It really didn't have any recommendations specifically today because we wanted to download the information and get some feedback. But so it kind of goes back to in my opening where on the one hand, we do need new revenue sources because of the great needs we have in infrastructure. And so coming at it from that point of view, we'd want to try and maximize new fees as quickly as possible. On the other hand, we're entering into uncharted territory, at least a deep recession in the short run, where we would want to help keep people employed in the private sector, and we'd want to balance then, the level of fees, recognizing that, at some point, very high fees might slow down investments in the private sector, but it's hard to gauge what the right balance is and where you draw the line. So, there might be a case that could be made for phasing in some of the fees over a couple of years to allow the economy to recover, but at the same time, increasing the revenue that we're getting. But it's just there's no easy way to gauge that because we're in such uncharted territory.
Right. And I was a little bit late jumping onto the meeting because of some technical difficulties, but I think I caught the tail end of that. And I agree with you. The consensus is overwhelming that, we're going to have at least at a minimum a deep short-term recession. And how long that drags on, or, whether we have a W-shaped graphical curve like Mr. Bricky spoke of, that's all yet to be determined. But I'd like to request that when you bring plans back to the board with respect to the mobility fees and parks impact fees for sure, that you bring a couple of scenarios that might involve holding off till 2021, maybe a plan that would show a phase-in that goes to the end of 2021, and also maybe a phase-in that goes to the end of 2022.
Yes. Okay.
Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. I have some questions about the mobility fee study. First of all, could I ask John Lyons one quick question about the costs? I see he's here.
Mr. Lyons, are you here?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Hi, just a quick question. So at this point, you have verified the costs of the transportation projects that are involved in the new updated version of the mobility fee, and thoroughly vetted the costs for accuracy, and you stand behind them?
Yes, ma'am. So we went back and looked at, met with the consultant after we met with you, and we chose projects that only went back as far as 2013. So those are our most recent. We haven't built very many road widening projects in the last several years. But those are reflective of that. And the good thing is we included both Citrus Park and Bell Shoals, which are currently under construction, and we have very good cost estimates.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for going back and doing that. And I'd like to thank you and your staff, and I know John Patrick cast an eye over this, and Neil Gunn and the Tyndale Oliver crew for working so hard again to update this and fine tune the study to make it reflect the costs as accurately as possible, so we understand, what we need to pay for. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and I have one other question about the study for Neil Gunn, I think. And it's about the ad valorem credit, and the it's for one thing. One place it is in Appendix D of the materials that we have on page 260. So the study assumes we'll give some discounts to the impact fees for one thing, for this ad valorem tax, and it's giving a discount for the funding commitment that the county is presumed to be making primarily to our $812 million plan, I think, and so it's counting $370 million over the next 6 years. That was on page 155. And then also here on Appendix D, it specified $53 million a year, $53.3 million a year for 6 years. They are taking a portion of that and crediting, so subtracting from the impact fee for the developer. And I think we've all just seen how unlikely it is that we are going to be able to fund, to maintain that funding commitment to the $812 million plan. That was alluded to several times in the budget presentation we just saw, that that this $812 million plan is going to see is going to be one of the biggest casualties of the economic downturn, from the lowered, everything from lowered gas taxes to other things. But I'll remind you, we did not fund the $812 million plan last year in a good year. So we're going to have a hard time. I just don't think it makes sense at this point to give a credit off the impact fees for our funding commitment when we know we're not going to be able to meet that funding commitment any longer. So while Neil Gunn is here, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, so we were basing everything on the CIP and the estimated revenue source, and we were only giving the credit for the 5-year period. We knew that it was going to end at the best case after 5 years. Mm-hmm. But if you remove that from the budgets, given all the things, then that credit needs to be adjusted downward as well. If the projects are deleted or reduced, or and that revenue source is no longer there, just like sales tax, if it's not there, we need to take it out.
So maybe this question is for our staff, Lucia or Garces or Mike Merrill. When this finally comes to us as a proposed ordinance, will there be conditional language in there to say if and when the surtax is stricken, we will no longer be giving that credit back against impact fees, and as it's determined year by year in each budget that we're not going to meet the 812 commitment, we would not also give that credit to the developers. I mean, how will that work?
So Commissioner Lucia Garces, couple of questions in there. One dealing specifically with the surtax. And you and I spoke about the surtax and this timing that's happening where we're moving ahead with a mobility fee ordinance, and there's an uncertainty about whether or not it will remain, whether it will be upheld. So probably more a legal question is, can you move forward with an ordinance that actually provides for two scenarios, one in the event that the surtax is upheld and one in the event that it's not upheld, so you actually move forward with two fee schedules? And I think I'd ask Cameron or Christine to opine on that piece of it. But the other piece that you raise about the ad valorem, and Neil Goon alluded to this in the very beginning, that there is a need to make sure, and Cameron can underscore this and maybe just highlight it from a legal perspective, but there is a need to make sure that the fee is reasonable and that we're not overcharging somebody. And so what we would be evaluating, and you have built in evaluations of the ordinance along the way, we would evaluate that to determine how those funding proposals are changing from year to year. So one, we need to make sure we're not overcharging and that the fee is reasonable. But two is you have an opportunity to relook at the funding requirements that are going into your capital program to determine if the fee needs to be adjusted or tweaked in accordance to that.
How often do we relook at that?
Well, we had, I think we had in the ordinance, the first time we were going to look at it each year. And I have to go back and ask my staff whether or not that is still in place, but you could place an annual review just based on the funding requirement. You could do that.
Last question, if I may, regarding this is, and I think this would probably be a question for Cameron as well, talking about the refunds of credits. I mean, if the Supreme Court does what some are suggesting they might and strike down, what many are suggesting they might strike down the surtax, and they may require us to offer some kind of a refund opportunity for to pay that tax back to people who file for a refund, having paid the tax this time all this time. Is there some way we could ask the developers who got a credit, of somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 from each house from the taxpayers, if we have to pay back that surtax, can we go get that back, that credit back from them?
This is Cameron Clark, Assistant County Attorney. I have to give some real thought as to how that would actually work, because once you can't get your certificate of occupancy until you pay your impact fee or your mobility fee. So once the CO is issued because the fee has been paid or it's been satisfied through some other mechanism like offsets, there's no way I can think of to go back and get more fee from somebody who's already paid their impact fees. They've got, they've mitigated their impacts pursuant to the fee as it existed at the time that they got their building permit and their CO. I just can't think of a way you'd somehow recapture if circumstances changed after they got their CO. I'm not sure how can't think of a way you'd be able to readdress that with fee payers that are really already out the door with their COs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Oberman, you recognize.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. And Commissioner Smith, I appreciate your questions. I think it is important that we, as we hear from our financial advisors, that there is a likelihood that the 812 plan will not be funded. Offering a credit against that's going to be tough. But in the surtax as well until we get resolution. But that being said, I wanted to ask Kevin Brickey and Tom Fessler, in your projections, the economists have come back and looked at a 26 to 30% decline as a consequence of their estimates on GDP. But the state of Florida's GDP, largest driver of GDP, is actually real estate. And so I'm curious if that estimated decline in gross domestic product is reflected in what way they anticipate as far as Florida's GDP. Are we assuming or not assuming that our ad valorem taxes will fall accordingly, even though there's a lag because we set the stick in the ground on December 31st? As far as values is concerned, that our GDP numbers are a little bit different in terms of how it's calculated as compared to maybe the rest of the country. Have we?
Okay. Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate all the.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm not. No, I'm here. Can you hear
Commissioner
me?
Merman, you need to speak up. You're breaking up some kind of way.
Yeah, I know there's a problem with my connection. When we last talked about this, it was really tough questions about population, where would the density be, we kept saying we weren't sure how much population do we want and where, and now we're not even sure. We're so unsure about everything right now that I'm not sure that anything can be approved until we know what effect, what kind of growth pattern we're going to be into. And I'm not sure anything can be done until into the third, maybe fourth quarter of our budget year. I understand the issues and how much things are needed, but we don't even know if we're going to need these dollars because we're not sure what the growth is. So I think we have to keep asking the tough questions. And one of them now is how much growth will we get and what will that equate to revenue before we approve anything? And that's just my comments going forward.
Okay. Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you, sir. I do think it is important for us to realize where we are economically, but I also know that, we've had several workshops on how to pay for things that we need to pay for. These aren't increasing fees based on really future growth. In some respects, it's raising fees to the fair cost of what it takes to take care of our citizens and grow as our economy grows. As we heard from George, we need a wastewater plant in order to be able to serve the South County residents based on the building that's there and based on the building that's already been approved that it hasn't hit the ground yet. If we undercharge for the impact and mobility costs associated with our county, just dealing with what we see coming down the pike, we will put the deficits on the heads of the current homeowners and businesses in Hillsborough County, where those that can afford it the least. So while I do believe that we do have to be sensitive to raising fees or making decisions, we still have to approve a budget And we still have to charge fair impact fees and mobility fees based on the work that's being done by our staff. So I do appreciate our staff's work. Obviously, we're not going to make any decisions today, but we have to approve a budget. And we have the numbers and 20 looks okay. But I think it's important that we recognize the costs don't go away. So thank you very much for your comments. And I do appreciate the sensitivity to where we are economically and the uncertainty that we have. But hopefully we will learn a little bit more as the year progresses and as we get closer to approving our budget. Thank you.
Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
Oh, I didn't mean to. I forgot to lower my.
Okay, all right.
Commissioner Miller? Oh, thank you.
We'll get to you, Commissioner Kemp. I'm getting to you. Just hold tight. Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. I just had it there. I wasn't sure it was seeable. Thank you. I just a couple comments, and I appreciate the comments that others have made, and particularly that analysis, Commissioner Smith, of the mobility fees. And I'm pleased to see the mobility fees have been, the study has been significantly, I would have to say, corrected to reflect, what I think the study should reflect. I really appreciate that. I have a couple questions, and one is, it doesn't seem, as Commissioner Overman said, that we can even wait for a month or two on our deficiencies with regards to our water and wastewater. I mean, I keep hearing how this is urgent. We've already lost more than $100 million in the past 5 years on AGRF. And we're hearing that we have, low pressure, a remodeling, a rechanging of what's out there. And it just seems like we cannot wait on the water and wastewater and the AGRF at all, in terms of being able just to accommodate the building that is going on at this moment. And I just wonder, I don't know if, George Cassidy or Mr. Merrill want to comment, but that just seems to me, we were told just now that was very critical and not really an option. So I expect that would come back to us sooner rather than later, and nothing that we can kind of phase in or ignore, but a critical, absolute need. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. Okay.
Mr. Cassidy?
Yeah, Commissioner, certainly at a workshop, we're generally not able to make any motions and make any recommendations other than, this is the state of the affairs right now. And to your point, we would need to bring something back pretty soon for you to consider as a board.
Okay, I just wanted to, it sounds like a very critical need at this time. The other is, in terms of the mobility fees, I'm wondering if Mr. Clark, Cameron Clark, could comment, or maybe Ms. Garces, in terms of a phase in anymore of the higher mobility fees, since that was raised. We can, I assume, if we wanted to put, for instance, the rural mobility fee at a higher rate or a full 100%, but the urban service area mobility fee at a lower rate, that's possible for us to do. Is that correct? Or
Commissioner Cameron Clark, I think you'd have to apply your phase-in rate uniformly. Obviously, the rural area is already assessed at a higher rate because the level of service is higher in the rural service area. And so in order to maintain that higher level of service, they're already paying a higher fee. I'd be concerned about equal protection issues if you were setting, if arbitrarily just set a specific lower number for urban and higher for rural. The reason that they're different in the data in the study now is because of that level of service distinction. I think what Tyndale Oliver's saying is that the study supports charging a higher amount in the rural than in the urban. But we have always done the assessment rate, the percentage that is uniformly across the zones.
Okay, I wanted to check. I thought that was probably the case, but I just wanted to be clear with that. And, you know, I again will say that I don't think we should have that one area that's exempted in our rural service area. So the in the RP2 area. And that's all.
Okay. Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
Just real quick, I do want to thank.
Commissioner Merman, we're having problems hearing you.
I know, I keep breaking up. I do want to thank George Cassidy. He really presented a good plan today. And I think that water and wastewater have always been kind of a separate issue, but they've gotten clumped in with all these other fees. And I think at the end of the day, you know, he's going to phase it in. If he has to build the whole plant, he'll build maybe a smaller plant that's expandable over time. And I think what he has done has been very reasonable. People they don't want any fee increases in their water bills right now. Thank you.
Okay. That seems to be all the hands that I see at this point in time. Mr. Merrill, is there anything you need to say before we adjourn?
Well, I guess nothing more to say, but I guess we're looking for direction here. If the next step would be, if the board so desires, to bring back these items and set a public hearing. So you can direct us to do that for any one of the impact fees or for them all together. The water and wastewater fees are different. They're unique. Mm-hmm. So what George has presented today is the best thing that we can come up with that keeps rates as low as possible, but takes care of a need that we cannot ignore. And we can't really ignore it much longer. I would say that water, wastewater, at least if the board doesn't want to address any of the others, we would want to bring that back to you May 6th to set a public hearing to get those rates in effect so that George can start contracting to get that plant expanded.
Mr. Merrill, I recommend that you do that on the May 6th agenda. That's a necessity. We can't ignore that one. That has to happen. So that's my suggestion and recommendation, that you bring back we can't take it to vote today, but bring back the wastewater item for it to set a public hearing at our May 6th meeting.
Okay.
Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. And I appreciate that the economy will be suffering for some time. We don't know how much or how long, but we do have some projections for that. And we already know we have our citizens suffering. And so many businesses are suffering, restaurants to hair salons to small businesses. So to suggest that the suffering taxpayers should subsidize this one industry of the home building industry is not where I'm at. I think it's clear that you only pay impact fees if you're building houses. So anyone who's building houses and working is in a better position than some of our other taxpayers who are trying to get to work on failed roads and get their kids to school on substandard roads that need to be improved, and driving on roads that need their potholes improved, and have to put up with the issues of traffic that we have been suffering. So while they're building is the time to be charging for the costs of infrastructure. And we've had citizens asking us for this for years, and all of us have been promising this for years, and I just think it all still makes sense. So I would be for bringing all of these fees back, impact fees back to us, so we can understand how we're going to pay for the infrastructure deficits we have now and the infrastructure deficits that will be building up if people are building and paying some impact fees. So that's where I'm at.
So Commissioner Smith, what are you recommending, that they bring back all the impact fees for a public hearing? Is that what you want to do?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Merrill, you have that recommendation?
Yeah, yes, I did.
Let me ask another question here. Commissioner Smith, is your recommendation to have a public hearing to implement all the impact fees at the fullest amount, phased in? What's your recommendation?
You know, let me see, am I still on? Okay.
Yes.
Costs are what the costs are. The taxpayers are not going to have the money. We're not going to have that $812 million money to pay for roads. We're not going to have the money to pay for the infrastructure required as new development is built. So we have the professional studies telling us what it costs. We have to charge that. That's a cost of doing business for that industry, and I'm not for subsidizing that one industry.
Okay, I didn't say anything about subsidizing. I said, do you want a public hearing or a full impact, a phased in impact fee? That was my question to you.
I'm for charging the full cost that it costs.
And that's what your recommendation is?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Mr. Merrill, you have that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Kipp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear because something was alluded to about ratepayers, our residents paying their water bills, as opposed to developer impact fees. And I think it's important. When I spoke about the AGRF and the wastewater and water impact fees, we are again talking about developer impact fees that must be done. The other part of it is that was in that was about the ratepayers, and I think a lot of what was shifted onto ratepayers has been because we've been negligent about the impact fees that we have not charged actually for decades, but certainly with the AGRF since 2014. And we wouldn't be in this position now. So I just want to be very clear that I'm talking about impact fees, developers' impact fees, that I cannot see how we can move forward without water and wastewater, the AGRF and the water and wastewater impact fees, which are both fees on developers.
Okay. Mr. Merrill, let me ask you a question. We talked about, we made a recommendation, I made a recommendation to bring back the water, wastewater impact fees. Commissioner Smith also talked about mobility fees. What other fee was there?
Parks.
Commissioner Smith, was it? Pardon? Parks.
ATR.
And she said bringing it as a full increase. Is there a way also you can bring it back with a staggered increase, some kind of way over a period of time that we can look at to possibly have that a discussion and possibly look at that as part of a public hearing also?
Yes, we can bring back for parks and for mobility fees, both. Well, what you saw today was the full fee in the presentations.
Right.
What we can bring back for parks and mobility fee then would be the phasing in of those up to the maximum that you saw.
Right.
For water wastewater, there really is not the ability.
No, I'm not talking about water wastewater.
Just the other two.
No.
Great.
Just the other two.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, we can
All
do
right.
that.
Okay, Commissioner Merman, you recognize.
Thank you. And Mr. Merrill, that way the third one would be AGRF, right? So it's AGRF, mobility fees, and park, right? three of them?
For water and wastewater, it would be the water wastewater impact fees, the AGRF, and the monthly user fees. For parks and for mobility, it would just be an impact fee.
Okay. Well, I definitely support what Mr. Miller is asking. I guess the last 2 months have really shown what our community is. I mean, we're a very strong community, but honestly, I look at Career Source and the people out of jobs and the flooding of the phones with our CARES Act program. I don't see how we can support full fees, though. I think let the people give their opinions on it. But I think at the end of the day, it definitely something phased in, if anything at all, right now should be considered. And so I support what Mr. Miller is definitely requesting.
Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that happens when you raise prices, people don't buy some things as much. And so if we were to charge a fair price for what our staff has told us it's going to cost to provide services, but we offer a waiver on that, we might get what we want when it comes to the waiver. And that is affordable housing. And that is affordable housing built near our workplaces and places where there are jobs. And that is something we desperately need. So if we can utilize the fair fee schedules, whether it's reduced or not, phased in or not, but actually charge the fair fee, and then offer the waiver program, which we're allowed to do for affordable housing in those areas where workforce and job centers are, we're going to get the outcome that we need to help this economy recover. So I do appreciate the idea of moving forward on this and having a public hearing so that we can talk about those issues and help the public see what we've seen as far as the deficit projections that we will have to face 4 or 5 years down the road if we don't move forward on smartly now. If it means we're not growing in areas that we can't afford to provide the services, then maybe we shouldn't be providing the services there. But it is important for us to look at responsibly at our budget and charge fair fees for what it costs us to actually do the work that needs to be done to serve our citizens. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Mr. Merrill, I think you had some recommendations and give them a direction. Am I correct?
Yes, so we will bring back on May 6th an agenda item, or probably 3 agenda items that would ask the board to set public hearings for all 3 fee areas: mobility, parks, and water wastewater. And then, then we'd be bringing them back probably the second meeting in May.
Okay. All right. I see no further discussion before us today. I want to thank all the staff members and all those that were participating today for your presentations. Job well done. We appreciate it. Other than that, stay safe, be careful, and we'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.